sent out or, oh, okay. Let me repeat that. Thanks everybody for coming. And hopefully you were able to watch the video that I sent out or read some of the papers. What I thought I would do is before we turn it over and have a general discussion is that I would point out some of the highlights about this predictive brain that we're going to talk about. And so the question that I raised or that we're trying to address is whether the brain is a predictive or a reactive system. And I think that question actually probably has been settled in the sense that we now realize that the brain is not a passive system. It doesn't just sit there and wait for input to come in. It actually is a very active processing device that actually anticipates and predicts things. And this makes sense because the world is actually quite uncertain and unpredictable, and yet we need to be able to survive in that world, right? Now, in the 1890s, William James, who's the father of American psychology, he said that babies come into the world in what he called a booming, buzzing confusion. This is how we experience the world initially. And so the question was, then how do we even begin to extract meaning from this confusing sense of energies that are bombarding our brain? And it turns out that, in fact, what we now know decades later is that we are born with a number of basic learning rules or algorithms that help us kind of jumpstart this process of extracting meaning from this confusing set of energies, right? And one of the basic rules, most of you have probably heard this one, is that neurons that fire together wire together, right? So the idea is that there's some significance in neuron A firing and then neuron B firing, and by doing that, they sort of make a connection, strengthen their connection, and we learn. So that's one of these basic rules. The other one is that out of that comes our ability to be able to track what are called co-occurrences, things that are, say, moving in the world and co-occurring at the same time. We're able to sort of identify that as a single object. So tracking co-occurrences is something that we do very well. And out of that comes this notion that we can do statistical learning, which is basically extracting the co-occurrences that occur in time and space, right? So we're very good from the very beginning at doing this kind of statistical analysis of the world and extracting these co-occurrences. So out of that comes this notion that the brain is predictive. So what does that actually mean? So here's the definition, and if I can move my thing out of the way, I can read it. So basically the idea is that we use these basic learning rules that we're born with and the knowledge that we acquire using them to then make inferences about what's going to happen in the very near future, right? So we anticipate based on what we know and what we're learning. But then what happens is that prediction is compared to the actual input, the sensory input that's coming in. And so you have this prediction and the sensory input coming in. If they match, then you're good to go. If it doesn't match, then the system generates what are called prediction errors, which then go back and allow you to change the model that you have of the world until eventually it fits the data that it's analyzing, right? And so prediction then, on the bottom right there is this notion that I like, which says that imagine if your brain is asking the question at every moment. The question is, the last time I encountered something similar, this similar situation, what did I do next? What did I feel? So the idea here is that the brain is asking that question and going back into its memory storage and saying, okay, last time I responded this way. And then that gets matched with the sensory input, right? So there's that comparison. hopefully that makes sense. The video that I sent out really makes a good case for how that happens, but I'm going to move on. Um, so the idea of predictive processing is not, it's not anything new. It's actually an old idea. It goes back to Plato, I think. But it's become much more relevant nowadays because of the amount of data that shows that this is what may be going on. And a lot of that comes from computer science or computational neuroscience. Because what we have learned over the past 20, 30 years is that if you try to create a computer model that is able to learn, and you let it go and it starts learning, eventually it implements a kind of predictive processing capability, right? If it's a learning system, it eventually gets into this way of predicting things. And this is essentially what an artificial intelligence system is. AIs are these highly sophisticated programs that are able to predict. They have this predictive processing ability. And so we think that the brain evolved that way. And the reason for that is because it seems to be the optimal way to reduce uncertainty while minimizing the amount of energy that you need to deal with that uncertainty, right? By predicting things, you're able to reduce that uncertainty, conserve energy, and while you move around in the world. So that's the idea. Okay. Now, so what's the evidence for prediction? So one of the strongest evidence comes from the notion of sports, right? If we weren't able to predict things, we probably would not be able to play sports. And so here's an example. Imagine an outfielder playing baseball, and he's going to catch a baseball. Now, this is actually a physics problem, right? So if you know all the factors on the top right, you see the factors of, you need to know the angle of the ball, you need to know the distances, and and so forth. And using all that information, if you know it ahead of time, you can compute where the ball is going to go. However, that problem becomes really, really complicated if you start adding things like the noise in the environment, the amount of lighting, whether the outfielder is in the sunlight or in the dark shade, the slipperiness of the grass, and so on. So that the factors then just simply make the problem so complex that it would take a long time for us to compute that, if we were doing it that way. It turns out that we don't use physics. There's a simple way to bypass all that mathematics. And what we know, the way we do it is, the way we track objects is we place that object in a certain location on our retina. And then as it moves, we maintain that object in that location, and we move relative to the object in order to maintain it in that location. And if the object then begins to get larger, we know that it's coming towards us. If it gets smaller, we know that it's moving away. And if it's not changing in size, it's probably going sideways, right? And so maintaining the object in our retinal location, and it gets closer and closer, bigger and bigger, until it gets close enough so that we can catch it, is probably the way that we do it, right? So we bypass the physics and the mathematics. But what's interesting about that, and I wanted to show you at the bottom, is a diagram of what happens when an outfielder catches the baseball, right? Now, I'm going to play it several times, because what I want you to notice is that as soon as the ball is hit, the outfielder begins to move, right? As if they are anticipating where the ball is going to go. And so part of the principle in predictive processing is that you move in order to see, right? So the outfielder has to move and place the object in that retinal location in order to track it. And he has to move relative to that in order to keep it in the same location. So movement becomes very critical. So movement or action is perception in a way, right? And so again, I'll play it one more time so you can see it, hopefully. Whoops, never mind. You see that, right? The outfielder begins to move as soon as the ball is hit. And so there is that kind of predictiveness, if you will, and movement, the criticality of moving. Okay. Now, so this sort of idea of the brain being a predictive machine can explain a whole bunch of stuff. And here are some questions I'm not going to go through because of time, but it can answer things like critical things like, why can't you tickle yourself? Right? And we can come back to these questions later, but a predictive processing system can better explain that than other kinds of explanations. Okay, what I want to get to is this. Predictive processing involves something called computing affordances and Bayesian inferences. Okay, kind of sounds complicated, but basically affordances are the kinds of interactions that an object in the environment provides to an individual, right? So when you look at a cup of cappuccino, like you're seeing there, before you even move to reach for it, your brain has already computed how you're going to interact with it. The fact that you may use the spoon to stir it, the fact that you may use your right hand to grab it, your index finger to go around the holder, that has already been computed by your brain before you even begin to reach for it. So these are what are called affordances. The cup has affordances that it provides to the individual, and you then compute how you're going to interact with that thing, right? And it's based on your own abilities, your own memories. So for example, if last time you reached for a cup of cappuccino, you spilled it, you might think about grabbing the saucer and bringing the cup and the saucer together to drink, right? Because of your past experience. Or if you can't move your arms, you might think about asking somebody else to bring it to your mouth or ask for a straw, or, so depending on your capabilities, you're able to compute how you're going to interact with that object. Okay, so here's the brain doing all this stuff, and it computes it in what's called its statistical inference of how it's going to do that interaction, meaning that it's the best guess. Right? It estimates what is the best way that I'm going to interact with that thing. So that's what Bayesian inference is, right? So at the bottom, there is this line that I like because it sort of gives the notion of the dynamics of this. So as we move in space, as we move around the room, we are continuously constructing a prediction of the world of affordances. Every object in the room is giving you this opportunity of how am I going to interact with that object? And your brain has already computed that as you enter a room. How are you going to sit? In which chair are you going to sit? Who are you going to talk to in the room? Et cetera, right? As soon as you enter the room, the brain has already processed all that information and you're ready to go, right? You're ready to interact. And so this is the idea of prediction. It helps you navigate the world in that sense. Okay. If your model of the world doesn't match the input that's coming in, you generate errors. You generate what are called prediction errors, and those then go back and change your model so you can tweak it a little bit to fit the data, right? And it's iterative, right? Iterative, that is, you change the model, data comes in, doesn't quite fit, you change the model until finally it fits, right? And you have a match. In order to generate the feedback and updating of the model, you need a system in the brain that has a global outreach. That is, it has to be able to touch the entire brain at once, because the entire brain is involved in this modeling and this prediction. And so you need an error feedback system that is global. And so there's only one system in the brain that is like that, and it's this one. It's called the locus coeruleus noradrenergic system, or the LCNE, locus coeruleus noradrenergic system. And on the right diagram, you see the LC label there. LC is a group of cells in the brainstem, about 30,000 cells in the human, 30,000 cells that have these projections to the entire brain. There's not a single millimeter of the brain that's not touched by those cells. It goes to the cerebellum, it goes to the spinal cord, it goes to subcortical area, it goes everywhere. And so when the locus coeruleus fires, it reaches everybody. It's a global system, which is what you need when there's a mismatch in your model and you need to reset that model, right? And this is something that I studied as a grad student. There's a signal that's generated when this system is activated. It's called the P300 signal, and it has two components to it. One is called the P3A, which is primarily generated by the frontal cortex, and the P3A is the signal that there's an error. So the frontal cortex says, "Oop, there's an error," and then it goes to the back part of the brain and generates this P3B, which is, okay, I need to update that model, right? So we're able to study this by measuring this P300 event. So again, we can come back to this if people are interested, but that's the error feedback system. Okay. Another interesting aspect of this predictive ability is that the brain uses this to fill in the gaps of any kind of sensory input that we're getting. And in doing so, it can actually create things that aren't there, what's called controlled hallucination. And so if you look at the bottom left, most of you should be able to see that there is this triangle in the forefront of the image, right? But yet that triangle doesn't really exist. It only exists in your brain, creating that sense of that there's a triangle when it's actually just empty space, right? But we see a triangle because the constraints of the stimulus. This is something called closure. On the right side is an even more interesting thing, and that is, I don't know if people see this, you either see a duck or a rabbit, right? How many see that, duck or rabbit? What's interesting is that the brain cannot settle on which it is. And so it flips back and forth. Duck, rabbit. Oh no, duck. No, rabbit, right? And it's like your brain is trying to understand the data, but the data are very ambiguous. The signals are very ambiguous, so it can't settle on one solution. So this goes to the nature of this sort of active, predictive thing that we're generating from the top down, saying, this is a rabbit or this is a duck. And in this case, we can't decide because of ambiguity, right? So this is what, these two things are what are called controlled hallucinations. And then finally, what I wanted to is just talk about this, that this kind of predictive idea provides another way of thinking about consciousness, that perhaps what we think of as consciousness is simply this model that we built from our subjective experience and the predictions that we're making based on our knowledge of the world, our internal dynamics, and the input coming in. All this stuff is creating this model, and our awareness of that model is what we think of as conscious awareness, right? We're just aware of what we're generating. So it's another way to think about it and maybe talk about it if you're interested. So anyway, so those are the main highlights, and I'm going to leave it there and open it up for discussion. Don't want to do that. Or any questions? If you had any questions about what I just went through, I know I probably went too fast.
What if What if things go wrong? What if what you see really isn't there? But I mean, I'm interested in some of the errors that, or mental illnesses. I mean, how does that fit into something?
Absolutely. So one of the ideas is because we are generating hypotheses as to what may be there. Uh, people think that maybe in schizophrenia, part of what happens is that there's a poverty of input coming in, or maybe too much input coming into these brains, and they're just generating things that aren't there. And so they see faces, when where there aren't faces. They hear people when there aren't any people talking, right? So it's simply the brain trying to generate hypotheses as to what's going on based on all this massive amount of data maybe that they're experiencing. So that's hallucination, and that's what I was talking about. In our case, in normal brains, they're controlled hallucinations, but in an abnormal brain, they may get out of control, right?
Can I do a follow-up question? This is Kim. I think
Yeah.
it's related. It has to do with dreaming. When you're dreaming, you're making some really bad predictions because they're all crazy. When you wake
Yeah.
up, you realize, is that P3A going wild? And when you wake up, you kind of solve it with P3B or something?
Yes. So there's the relationship is the following. When we're awake, we have this system, this predictive error system, working, keeping us on track, if you will, right? Because it's telling us, okay, you need to update the model. Here's an error, match it properly. When we sleep, what happens is this system is actually turned off. This prediction locus coeruleus norepinephrine system actually goes offline, especially during REM sleep. So it isn't there to provide the feedback, if you will. And so I think what the brain tends to do, it tends to just go haywire. So dreams are essentially the generation of these hypotheses, but with no feedback to say, these are correct or not correct.
Real quick,
Dorothy, I think you're muted.
do other animals have this LCNE?
Yes, this is a very primitive system. It's in most mammals. Fish have it. Yeah, so it's very primitive.
Don Bamber has a hand up. He's next.
Jamie, I wonder whether you've thought about partial reinforcement effects in these using these concepts. So if say a pigeon is in a box and the light comes on, it punches something with its beak, it gets a pellet or whatever, and anyway, the pigeon learns to press the button whenever the light comes on.
Mm-hmm.
But if the pigeon stops getting rewarded, let me back up. Suppose the pigeon is rewarded every time the light comes on and it pushes the button, and then all of a sudden it stops. There's no more reward anymore. The pigeon stops pushing the button fairly quickly. On the other hand, if the pigeon was rewarded only part of the time,
Right.
then it will continue pressing the button much longer
For a
after.
longer time, yeah.
And one way you could think about this is the pigeon is trying to figure out whether the world has changed.
Hmm.
Is the mechanism that's rewarding me, has it broken? Is it no longer working? If the pigeon was getting rewarded every time it pushed the button, then it would quickly get evidence that the system wasn't working anymore.
Absolutely.
But if,
Right.
but if the pigeon was only getting rewarded part of the time and then the reward stopped, it would take the pigeon longer to figure out that there's been a change in the environment.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you can think about your ideas about prediction in these terms.
No, I think you're right, and there's a lot of evidence from the learning literature that what you're saying is absolutely right. The more infrequent the reward is, actually, the better the learning and the more maintained the learning becomes. You know, and so there, it could be a function of predictiveness, but there are other things going on that probably explain it as well. So I wouldn't say that it's all based on predictiveness, although part of it could be. And this really plays a big role in addiction. You know, when people get addicted, if the rewards are only happening every once in a while, they tend to be addicted for a longer period of time than if it's a regular kind of thing. It's easier to get out of that behavior.
Yeah, has a hand up. Julia, unmute yourself.
You're muted. Oh, okay. She went away.
I think Julia's having trouble unmuting herself. I have,
Can you unmute her?
I don't think I can. I can only ask her to unmute, and she's figured that out. She just is saying she knows she needs to unmute herself, but she can't figure out how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Send your question in a text chat, Julia. Manu has a question here, I think.
Yeah.
What about the dreams, nightmares? How is that related?
Well, some people think that dreams are a kind of hallucination as well. As I mentioned, dreams tend to be uncontrolled in the way that we think of, because systems like this one are essentially inhibited during sleep, right? So if you inhibit the feedback system, it can't provide the information that this dream may be getting out of hand or that it's not correct. And so the brain just tends to go with whatever it is, right? So that's one possibility about dreams, nightmares, all sorts of things. They're just uncontrolled hallucinations. Whereas with this system online, we have more of controlled hallucinations going on.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. And
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that with the predictive model in mind, it would be fun to go back in one of our next discussions to sleep, because sleep involves the replaying, or may involve some replaying of memories and consolidation, taking those memories from the hippocampus up to the cortex, or of putting various engrams, various combinations, which are probably predictive patterns, but putting them together in different adaptive and creative ways. So it'd be very fun to go back to that. Tom has his hand up next.
Yeah,
Sure.
I don't know if Julia got her, no, she's still muted. Yes.
No, I figured it out.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Well, Julia had her hand up first, if you'd like.
Yay, Julia.
Ladies before.
It's the iPad thing. Well, two things. So I didn't realize that it's the intermittent reinforcement that lasts longer is what's going on with the addiction thing, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of it. Yeah.
So my question was, in the YouTube video, which was fabulous. Thanks for that, Jamie. So Michael Pollan, one of his examples was the face, the mask, convex to concave. And once you see it as a correct face that is convex, you can't unsee it again, right? It stays that way. So, but how does that fit in then? They were talking about there is an override and they found it in humans specifically, not in other animals, that is unique so far to humans and babies at 6 years age or whatever. How does that fit with the P300 signal and the P3B and the locus ceruleus noradrenergic? Can you
Uh,
can you
Well,
I mean,
so what Julia is saying, if people didn't see this, is that if you play a mask, a rotating mask that's a face mask, and you rotate it, that at some point you should see. So this is convex. As it rotates, you should see the mask in concave form, but because our brain has decided that all faces are convex, it does not allow you to see that. And so what happens is, as you see this face turning, you actually see a pop-up and it goes back to convex. It doesn't allow you to see the concave mask
right,
because of the
right.
learning that the face is convex, and this is the expectations, this is the prediction, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So that's what's happening in that case. Now, what Poland said was that it's possible to inhibit that prediction. And he was saying that people that use LSD, for example, have reported that they're actually able to see the concave mass, because apparently what LSD does, it inhibits what are called the priors, the things that the brain
Yeah.
uses to create the prediction. If you
Right.
inhibit the priors, then you actually see things as they are. You see
Which
both
is
the
what you were
concave and
talking
convex.
about.
Right.
And he said that schizophrenics don't have that same response. So it's all part of the same. They keep seeing they don't default,
That's right.
you know?
Right. Right. The same thing with
Wow.
schizophrenia. That's right.
Wow.
Because somehow
Okay.
they've interrupted this prior sense of information that we have that says faces are convex, right? Yeah. That was fascinating. I didn't know that myself about LSD and schizophrenia. So
Tom has his hand up.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions. I'll ask them one later. But this question of animals having the locus ceruleus noradrenergic system, and it raises for me the question as to what do we mean by animals, for example, and what does this suggest in our usual categorization? For example, at the highest level, we're talking about animal versus vegetable. And if you just go by that, then that would mean you would think that ant is not a vegetable. It's an animal if you just divide things up that way. But the question is, what animals? I guess really what it comes down to is the question of what animals have it. How far would it go? What are the boundaries of what equals an animal for the purpose of having the LCNE system?
yeah. Well, the noradrenergic part of it goes back to even plants. Plants have noradrenergic, norepinephrine. It's another word for it, norepinephrine. You find that in plants, and so that's a hormone. It's a chemical that in plants it's necessary for certain things. But what seems to have happened is that in animals, evolution took advantage of having that hormone and applied it to other things, other functions, if you will. It adapted that to other functions. And part of one of those functions is this ability to reset and predict, to reset the prediction, basically, right? And it seems to be necessary for the lowest animal that at least in the mammalian line, all mammals have this locus ceruleus norepinephrine system. So it seems necessary for them. They all create models, they all create expectancies, they all need to reset, and so it's there to do that.
Yeah. So yeah, and then the question is, how far does that go? For example, we talked about birds who are not mammals, but maybe we just don't know the answer to that question.
No, we actually know the birds have it as well.
Okay, the system, not right. And then Well, and okay, then how about ants, for example?
No, as far as we know, insects probably don't have it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't think they
Yeah.
have it.
Okay. It's just, it gets very interesting then, what sort of possibilities of
Sure.
the controlled hallucination, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got
Absolutely.
it. Okay. Okay. That's all of that particular question. We'll go on for other questions.
Dave
Yeah.
Kretzmann has a hand up.
Yeah. Is this me?
Yeah.
This is really related, because I always wondered this thing called the connectome where you section through different brains and you can get the location of all possible neurons.
Mhm.
With the 30,000 cells that make up this LCNE should be visible in that. Is that right, Jamie? And if that's true, I think they did the connectome for the fruit fly is the latest one. Would that tell you exactly where that evolved? At what level of animal? What level of brain that evolved?
I'm not quite sure I quite understood the question. So just to keep in mind, when we talk about connectome, we're talking about the connections between neurons,
Right.
right? So the LCNE is not part of that.
Oh, okay.
The LCNE is what we call a modulatory system, which is outside of the connectome, if you will, right?
Okay.
And so there hasn't been a mapping of those systems yet, as far as I know.
Super. All right.
Yeah.
Am I next?
I think you're next.
Okay. I'm really interested in how the brain perceives a self.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that the priors, the predictive models, not only model one's external environment, but also one's internal thought processes. And the video I thought was great. In terms of using hallucinogenic drugs that suppress these predictive models, it's not just the exterior environment that changes, but also one's simulation of a self seems to kind of melt away in some cases.
Yeah.
And I wondered how that relates to the default mode network, which which is maybe the simulation running in our head that
Mhm. No, that's a good question.
Exactly.
So back to your idea. So here's my definition of consciousness and prediction. So prediction, you are predicting both the external and the internal environment, bringing those things together, right? And so the sense of the subjective sense of who we are is part of this internal prediction, right? Now, what's interesting to me is that that sense of self doesn't really begin right away in the human brain. It takes some time to develop a sense of self, right? Theory of mind and all that comes online until you're like 4 years of age. So before that, we don't have that sense of inner sense of self, as far as I know. So it's interesting then to think about that, right? So we at some point during our development, the sense of self comes online. It gets integrated with the predictive abilities to predict the external environment, and so now you have both internal, external predictions. That's really all I can say now. In terms of how does it relate to the default mode? So the default mode network is related to that sense of self, right? And so these are areas of the brain that relate to processing of so self-referential information, right? Things that are related to me as they affect me and that kind of thing. And again, these are things that come online much later in development. right? But as they come online, they get integrated into the predictiveness capabilities of the brain. Yeah.
As an aside, as a clinical psychologist for 37 years, I wish I'd been more aware of the psychedelic interface with, well, didn't happen back then, with psychotherapy, because there would be patients who would come in whose default mode network were so rigid that I just wish there was a way to just shake it up and,
Yeah. And so this is what's happening now. I mean, there's a lot of clinical
Right.
studies using these tools
Exactly.
to essentially turn off the default mode network.
PTSD and
right?
depression and
Yeah.
fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah.
On our trip, we had a lunch with a cousin, and he had experimented with some psychedelic drugs. And his sense, one episode he told me, is he imagined that his self shrunk down to like a grain of sand that was embedded in this monument, and he realized he was going to be there for 50,000 years, and that was okay with him. So I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah,
And that's
like,
typical of LSD, right?
it is.
That
Yeah.
change in perspective and becoming one with the universe, and your molecules are a part of. I'm still wanting to try it. My son is like setting it up, but I haven't gotten there yet. But seriously, I want to experience what Dave's. It was what'd you say? Your brother?
Cousin.
Mm-hmm. My recommendation, though, is not to try LSD unless
No,
you're doing.
Exactly. And he has a whole. They have new testing kits, and it's just too darn expensive to actually do it through a program, right?
But studies show that more natural kinds of things like meditation actually do the same thing. They turn off the default mode network. Not quite as much.
You have to be a real master to get to that.
You need a lot of practice.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, I understand that.
Dorothy, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, this is a technicality, but I'd like to go back to the locus coeruleus. And now norepinephrine it's a neurotransmitter, but it's related to adrenaline.
Yeah.
And so it's related to motion in a way. So that ties in with the model. But my question is, when the locus coeruleus sends its message, is it being sent by releasing a norepinephrine at all those places in the brain? Or is it, say a little bit more about the P300, I guess is what I'm really saying. What does P300 do?
So imagine a cell in the locus coeruleus in the brainstem. It fires, and then the signal goes out through one of these long fibers, right? And all throughout that fiber, there are release points. So it's not like it goes all the way to the end and then releases norepinephrine. It's all along the fiber. There are release points. So it's releasing norepinephrine as it goes along, right? So that's one thing. So it literally floods the entire brain because of that. So the other thing is, and this is what I did for my PhD thesis, was the question, what happens if I inhibit the locus coeruleus in animals? We did this in monkeys. If I inhibit that, what is the reaction? If this is critical for predictiveness and things like that. Now, so the P300 is also known as the surprise signal of the brain, right? So when something unexpected, unpredictable happens, you experience surprise, and that's the P300. If I measure your brain at that point in the surprise, you exhibit a P300. So it's the surprise event. If you inhibit the locus coeruleus, animals don't show a P300. They don't show the surprise. It's like, they can't compute that there's a prediction
novelty novelty
That's
or
right. They can't predict novelty. They don't understand novelty. I
what
mean, that's
what
our
happens
interpretation. Yeah.
what happens with anxiety? I mean, novelty, surprise, you know, the adrenaline component.
So
What happens with
in
that?
people who are hyper
Vigilant?
anxious and fearful and things like that have a high rate of firing in the locus coeruleus. A high rate of firing for some reason.
The-
You know, I
the
don't know what that
corollary of-
means.
A
but-
corollary of that is if the locus coeruleus is present way down evolutionarily,
Mhm.
and if it's involved in this prediction system that might be related to consciousness,
Mhm.
then does this really say that our brains are that similar to other things, and so consciousness, or at least the same predictive thinking, goes way down the evolutionary tree?
Maybe.
Well,
Yeah.
Michael,
You know,
Michael Pollan talked about that with the merge that only humans have, right?
But that really bothered me when he said that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what merge he was talking about, what that meant.
I was hoping you could explain it to us. Bummer, Jamie.
But going back to what Dorothy was saying,
Mhm.
so one of the mistakes I think we make is thinking about, okay, something is in the brainstem, therefore it's more primitive. That we need to throw that away because we
Oh.
don't think that that's the case. I think the brain organized itself in such a way that it's put certain things in specific regions because that's optimal as to its function, not because it's more primitive. So this idea of, you know, the evolution of the triune brain, you know, that we have a reptilian brain and then in an emotional brain and then a neo, you know, that's an old idea that it's really misleading. The brain is highly organized and it has spatially organized things in such a way that it's optimal for the locus coeruleus to be where it is in order to reach everything. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Right? Yeah. So I wouldn't call it more
Mhm.
primitive and therefore, you know, whatever.
But
It's just another point of view.
But a locus coeruleus like function is present in a lot of organisms, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, so it's more primitive in that sense, if that's what you mean. More, that is, it's older, if you will. I would call it older, you know, in that sense that it's found in a lot of animals. Yeah.
Maybe it's more evolved and complex in whatever, primates, elephants, us. I mean, you know, dolphins, whatever.
They all have it, and it's been maintained throughout. So
Well,
it means that
the
it's a critical.
sense of self thing, you know, like
Yeah.
dolphins can see their reflection and know it's them, and same
Yeah.
thing with primates and us. So,
So the other thing I wanted to say to Dorothy's point, that area where the LC is, it's not just the LC that's there. That's the origin for other systems too, like the serotonin system, acetylcholine system, histaminergic system. They all originate in that little region of the brainstem. So again, the brain placed them all there for some reason, not because, you know, they're more primitive, but I think there's such a strategic reason, you know, it's more functional, I think.
Maybe shared is more what I was meaning rather than primitive, and that is, I think the serotonin system is also found in a lot of organisms.
That's right.
So neuromodulator systems are found in a great diversity of organisms. And so I'm still going to maintain that I wonder if our brains aren't more similar than we like to admit. I'll let Tom go on. I'm just.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I think brains
Yeah.
are more similar than we realize. Okay, Tom.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if Mr. Wise, I see if he has his hand up before I did, and I already had a
Okay.
question, but.
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, okay. So this, as things go on, I end up with more questions, but this is my next question came up from the conversation. You mentioned about the connectome and
The what?
the connectome. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Connectome.
Connectome.
Connectome. Yeah. Yes. And you said that it's about the connections neuron to neuron. And the fact that the connection regarding the LCNE has not been mapped yet. Is that, so does that mean that the difference between something like the LCNE situation and perhaps other things that are acknowledged to now into the acknowledged to be within the known connectome, right? I'll put it that way, is simply whether or not its connectome is not yet known and that it could be mapped.
I missed something. Can you ask the question again? Because I missed.
Yeah. Basically, you said in response to a question about a connectome of the LCD, and it was based on that, and you clarified about connectome.
Yeah.
So connectome, the boundaries of the connectome is just what has been mapped. But the LCNE at some point could be mapped, and then that would be part of what we call the connectome. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, typically, it's I don't know how to explain it, but none of the modulatory systems that we've been talking about, like the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system, the serotonin system, acetylcholine system, they haven't been mapped in the same way that the connectome has been mapped, because it's easier to do the connectome in neurons because it's point to point, right? And so you can trace the map from point A to point B. Whereas these systems, they're really global, they go everywhere, they're messy, they're not point to point. And so if you can't really map them, it's like going into the forest and it's like covered with everything, right? That's the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. It's brush everywhere, right? Instead of a highway running through the forest, which is the connectome, it's just like brush everywhere.
Awesome. Yeah, great explanation. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So following up, one of the first things you said, Jamie, was that our brains or our biological neural networks, they run on minimal energy, which is essentially glucose and ATP. So I'm kind of compare biological neural networks to those in computers. And in a recent lecture, Jeffrey Hinton was talking about this comparison, how in silico, in a computer, ultimately you can have enormous amounts of power and what he called efficiency and accuracy, whereas in our brains, probably limited by just our essential needs for evolution, we run on minimal energy and it's not quite as efficient. So I wonder if there's any thought about the AI evolving, if you will, to something that matches or exceeds or mimics the biological, apparently simpler neural networks.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on neural networks, but all I know is that neural networks tend to imitate the brain, but in a very loose way. Right, in a very loose way, we say that they're like the brain, but in fact, they're really very different machines. But what happens is in a learning neural network, you have these nodes, right, these units, if you will, and when you let the network loose, they will start making connections, just like in the real brain, depending on activity, depending on cells or nodes that act together, wired together, and so they'll wire themselves up. This is what the brain does. And what I was suggesting is that they do that in a way that leads to this predictive processing capability. Right? So so that's as similar as I understand it.
I know Jeffrey Hinton was getting nervous. He's the guy that retired from Google
Yeah.
when two AI systems were
Yeah.
starting to talk to each other and having opinions about what to do. And so
That is scary.
it's a bit spooky.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is the evidence, or I don't really understand about minimizing energy? What kind of energy is minimized? I mean, what's the evidence is for minimizing energy?
What's the evidence
what?
for?
She said evidence for minimizing energy.
Use it.
Oh,
Brain.
what's the evidence for minimizing energy in the brain?
ATP limitation, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the brain, it's interesting. The brain as a whole uses about 20 watts of power, for the entire thing.
Right.
20 watts of power, which is like a light bulb, lighting a light bulb. That amount of energy is what the brain requires to do this incredible amount of processing. It is highly efficient in that sense, much more efficient than artificial machines. They're nowhere near this. The AIs require a whole city of electrical generating machines to run the AI. The brain needs about 20 watts of power, so it's highly effective in using energy in that sense. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's yeah.
I tend to believe it has not much to do for energy, but rejecting like transistors. Yes or no, whether that's true or not.
I'm having a hard time understanding. Can you get closer to the speaker, maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just an opinion.
Yeah.
I think it's not so much for conserving energy, but the brain working like a transistors to just work on a yes or no mechanism. So you see in transistor system, electronic system, is a yes or no answer reduces a lot of the number of network required to do something.
Oh, yeah. But the brain still needs energy, and like Dorothy was saying, there are mitochondria. There's a whole network that supplies energy to cells. It's just that they're highly efficient in what they do. Yeah.
Let's talk about this afterwards.
Tom, will you have another question?
Well, yeah, it was something that came up, and it was somebody else's question. It could be Mr. Wise's question, but it had to do and I'm not sure if this relates to it, but when one of the speakers, the one who was the hardest to understand and hard to follow, but I maybe want to rewind to hear what he had to say about it.
On the YouTube you're talking about, Tom?
Yeah,
The Christos Papadimitriou, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
And somebody asked him the question about whether or not research on the brain could be used to inform AI. And his answer was, and I think somebody echoed this in their question one time here, is that in fact, it seems that his view, he was pessimistic about that. Commenting that whenever you apply for a grant, you want to say, oh, well, this study may support AI, but he's actually pessimistic because of the constraints on the human development that are natural, biological, and evolution are not something, those constraints suggest that there may be limited efficacy to what we could learn from the human development of consciousness or human development in this area that would lend support to knowing support AI development in some way.
Yeah, well, I kind of not agree with that at all, because I think lately, for example, AI systems have been what are called feed forward systems. That is, they go from one area to the next in a kind of feed forward way to do their computation. And there's no feedback. Up until now, there has not been this sort of feedback which you find in the brain. The brain has sort of feedback. Well, that Chinese AI that came out recently, and the reason why it created such a stir is because they're beginning to use feedback based on what they know about the brain to provide even more intelligent processing. And suddenly they're able to exploit that capability. So I think we're learning a lot from the brain, applying to AI, and I think that's the way it should be.
Yeah. Was I right about how I understood what he said? Is that?
I don't remember because I had a hard time hearing
Well,
him as
he
well.
was the one.
Yeah,
He was
right.
the one talking about the merge.
Yeah.
And
that one.
and I had trouble, like you did, Tom, kind of getting his points anyway. And so darn it.
What
He-
did you understand that he meant by merge?
Well, that's why I was asking you. I mean,
Oh, okay,
my
okay, yeah.
concept was when they were talking about, the history of bottom up processing and then top down was, so he said something about the humans are capable of the merge and they haven't found it in anything else. And then I have Britain below it, which maybe it may not be connected, but perception has an inner life, and what is it, and what's the assembly process, and
Oh, yeah,
it was the flow back and forth sort of thing.
Right.
And computers and other animals are not capable of the merge. So shoot, well, we should do another. We should
I'll look into it and
you
come
look
back to
into
you.
the merge.
Yeah, I got the same puzzle about his answer, but he had up on top of the slide there the thing he called the assembly of neurons that do things like memory and words and ideas. Then he had operations on these physical assemblies, and that's where it got mushy to me. But he's the ability to project and associate, predict patterns and reciprocate, and he called all that stuff merge, and was claiming that capability was more human than simpler systems. My question
I interpreted him as just having a way higher intelligence than I did, and he's got all these connections going up here, which his ability to impart this with these connections and explain them are different. I wasn't able to do it.
Well, Julio, did you ever hear that saying, bullshit scares brains?
No.
Just considering the possibility. Okay, that's all. I couldn't resist throwing that out there. So,
Yeah.
well, yeah, and all right. So I'll wait. I do have a next question. I see Mr. Wise still has his hand up. I don't know if he's complete with what his question.
Yeah,
was.
real quick, this is a follow-up on Jamie on how we perceive, or your outfielder catching the ball and making predictions. Now, it seems like that's very similar to the issue of setting up an anti-ballistic missile to shoot something down. Do you know how they actually do that computationally? Because I mean that's not involving a retina and an eyeball, but and that may be all classified. But I just wondered if you have any idea how they solve that problem.
I really don't. I'm not.
I can answer that question to some degree. A lot of calculations. Like there was a guy in one of my jobs at one time. There was a guy in an office that sat right next to me who did just that in connection with working on such trajectories and so on. And that's what he did with the Department of Defense. This was using that same type of thing, but that's all he did was do all these friggin' calculations.
So they did the physics rather than using a retina or something.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
The thing with physics is that you got to know all the factors, though. All the
Yeah.
it's just a ton of dozens and dozens of things that could affect it. So
Yeah.
it becomes a really difficult problem. But yeah.
In missile detection, I worked in that area a little bit, just on the margins. And there's predictive models there too. You basically have to know in advance the kind of capacity or capabilities of a particular missile or a family of missiles to narrow what it's capable of, whether it can alter its trajectory or whether it's a fire jet. So there's a lot of predictive factors that go into narrowing the computations.
Yeah.
Are we going to talk about your questions, Jamie? Or, I mean,
Now let's.
I think Tom has a question. You mean these questions?
Yeah, we've reached the bottom of the barrel of my questions.
Oh, those questions.
Actually, one of
no,
the
the questions that you thought up.
Well,
Just wondering.
as Jaime was introducing me to continue with this, this is one from the beginning that has been waiting because other questions came up from things that other people said wisely. So, and this is a very high level type of question in this, and it is, so now we know about this predictive nature and we talk about in this predictive nature. Now, but it seems like, oh yeah, and there's the thing that was even raised here, this the possibility of what does this, is this consciousness, or is this what consciousness? And my question is, well, does this answer the hard question, to use David Chalmers' phrase, about how we get from the material, which is sort of an ignorant, when we examine that, what we're talking about of the nervous system, to this subjective bubble of awareness, if you will, that is a first person eye or experience, not to be of substance to us. But all those concepts are very primitive because we don't know what energy is. We don't know what matter is. Matter gets very mysterious when we really start looking at it. So it's sort of a false question, but a very good question to pursue, to discover the errors or the assumptions in that question, which tend to be kind of ignorant in a way, but a great question. So I'm wondering, because you say, oh yeah, we know this thing is going on. We're so impressed with it. Like other things, when we get some knowledge, we think, oh wow, especially if it's something big like this, right? And I think, oh yeah, we got the solution. But it's just that it's so impressive, like we get so impressed with our knowledge, with the knowledge, that now we think we have an answer. But I don't know if it provides an answer to this thing that is still a mysterious to us, in the sense that we don't know all the details of how it happens, because we don't know enough about the universe quite yet as to how we end up with consciousness as a result of, or at least in part, of something that we can perceive as matter. So does this in some way help solve the David Chalmers' hard question of how we get to matter to mind?
No, I don't think so. I think it provides an alternative explanation to what consciousness may be, a prediction that we make. But how we get from to the hard problem, I don't think that answers that question. What I think it gives us is another possibility of testing the so for example, if it were possible to eliminate the feedback, the top-down feedback that the brain provides, let's say you could do that in a human being. Let's say you gave him a chemical that was able to inhibit that feedback projection. Would they lose their sense of identity, their consciousness, I mean, that's that would be the prediction, right? Unfortunately, we don't have the tools to do that. We can't really do that in a very clean, effective way, right? but it provides the tools. Maybe later, we'll get better at these things and we'll be able to do that. And that'll be one question, right?
Yeah. And I think we'd still be stuck with the problem. Okay, so we just find out one more thing. It would be just more detail in the issue of how we in the train of matter to mind, but it still doesn't show the final movement, right? If you will.
Oh, but it would answer the question. Do you understand what it means to be for things to be red, for example? What the concept of red? If you inhibit that top-down connection, do you lose that sense of redness? If you do that, so that would answer. I think would answer that the hard problem in that sense. If you're not able to have that sense of redness or sense of does that make sense? Yeah.
You mean the color red or reading something?
No, the color red.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I think you're still stuck with the hard problem. You just found out another detail of what the matter has.
Tom, God just created it, it just is.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I'm joking. I'm joking.
Yeah,
Oh.
and in fact, that's the ultimate answer for me. Like, well, it exists, so WTF?
We just don't understand it, right?
It happened.
No, and I'm kidding. This is an atheistic, inappropriate comment.
Yeah. No, I'm saying it wasn't such a joke. Actually, it really was right on.
Yeah, we're nowhere near being able to answer those questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Arlene Gilbert has her hand up.
Yeah, this business of matter to mind, etc. I think under conditions of extreme stress, we lose a certain sense of self sometimes, and it's very frightening. I don't know if others have experienced that sort of thing, but it's almost sometimes when you first wake up in the morning, but it's mostly stress. So I think that sense of self is something that keeps us alive. I mean, it is basically what it means to be human. I'm not a scientist, I'm a writer, but as any human being that has lived as long as I have lived, there have been times of stress when you lose a certain feeling of not consciousness, but awareness. Just wanted to mention that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think we've exhausted all the questions, so.
I have a question, and that is, how would we like to continue along this line or a related line for next month? And if I remember right, and I was just trying to pull up my list of possible topics, but I think there were some other topics related to the locus ceruleus that we had early, that someone suggested earlier on. I maybe can't find my table of people's suggestions here. The other thing that I'd be interested in would be going back to sleep, because it seems to me that, the sleep has these other functions of consolidating learned things. And for a while, one doesn't want, and so we maybe need to turn off the external predictive mechanism while memories are being consolidated. And there's new information about sleep coming all the time.
I have a question related to your the topics, and that is, I can't tell, since I'm not the leader, how many people are attending this particular Zoom?
12.
12.
Which is about what we were getting in person, and maybe I should explain why we're on Zoom this time.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking about what direction is most attractive to the majority of the group, getting more granular or getting like sleep, which embodies a lot more potential offshoots and conceptualizations than the locus ceruleus.
Okay.
What's other people's takes on that in general?
Well, if you're,
Manu says she likes sleep. She's
yeah, I like sleep too.
I mean, in general, because I'm not a hardcore scientist. Are people wanting to get more granular or more, well, like go in the direction of Christos Papadimitriou in terms of, there's a certain level of which all of us understand, all of us, at least in this group, understand, are capable of understanding, have enough background. And then when, in my experience, when it gets so very specialized, I kind of see, and maybe I'm projecting, I think people tend to kind of glaze over.
Sherry
And
has-
maybe I'm projecting.
It's a good point, Shirley. Sherry has her hand up. Unmute yourself, Sherry. Unmute yourself.
Oh,
Can't hear you.
I know, it was hard to figure out.
She's working on it.
There.
There.
I think sleep would be great, and also how different types of personalities relate to what we've talked about today. I've really enjoyed, and I must say, Celeste Kidd's interpretation
Yeah.
of knowledge and accumulation of knowledge for children, because of course I've worked with children all my life, and I've seen a connection actually between what she said and actually what I've seen in the classroom through, I mean, when you consider the history of learning with children, phonics and whole language and everything else, it kind of goes back to, or emphasizes what she said in her speech segmentations. And
Yeah, wasn't that fascinating?
Really
yeah, it
interesting.
really was. And to figure out
Whoa.
syllables, how it worked. Of course, she probably has a very bright child that she's working with very closely. The statistical
Maybe.
learning in that case was very, very interesting to me.
Mhm.
I don't know how we can kind of tie that into maybe sleep and personalities. And I mean, I have done a little research here myself. So how does everybody else feel?
Well, here's the tie-in particular, Sheree, that I see with your take is that embodies exactly what I'm talking about. You're a teacher, I'm a psychologist, different sorts of scientists and whatnot, but we all can understand the concept of whatever language acquisition or, children's default mode network developing and whatnot. I personally like the concept of having topics where we can all relate in some way, even if we don't have that specific scientific knowledge.
I also have a background in psychology and work
Right.
very closely with gifted middle school children
Exactly.
as their backboard, so they could just talk to me all the time about their problems. And so I don't know, Jamie, that might not be your thing. I don't know. Based on a comment.
Well, it kind of is. It was like question number 3 and we didn't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Well, the one thing that I see might be consistent, we could talk about sleep and how it develops from infancy until old age. There's some really fascinating things that happen in infancy and some fascinating things that happen in old age. And that whole developmental trajectory is really fascinating. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one
It sounds to
possibility.
me like we have two interrelated topics that could keep us going for a while.
Yeah.
One would be the sleep related to development, but then we could start with that video that we had and look up some of the papers of the speaker there and some of the related reviews, and we could do some things on the developmental psychology that has led to this idea of the predictive brain.
It's like Piaget all over again, right? Yeah, well, no, I mean, right? It's wonderful. It's just,
Yeah, but I think the studies are even more, they're not just observational anymore.
I realize that. I'm just saying we can all get it. And
Yeah.
we've all
Yeah,
observed
yeah.
it and we've all felt it and we've had children and we, you know, so we can all connect
Yeah.
or taught it or.
Yeah.
Manu has something to say here.
I personally prefer to have a scientific edge to our discussion.
Mm.
You know, it's called the science group in a sense, and well, that's just an opinion.
Well, I consider, yeah, absolutely. And I consider all of that science as well.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
it is a bioscience group. And
Yeah,
isn't this
yeah.
a great example? Isn't this very
Yeah,
one we had today? You know, we could talk about, you know, like I know like the Supreme Court said, I know pornography when I see it. Well, what we've seen is this today, and it
Yeah,
has this
yeah.
all this complete of level. You know, we have all levels here, and so we do get the bioscience to it. We also get at a level that people can relate to as well.
Mhm.
So isn't this a good, do we agree that what we saw today was a good example of something that is you know, the ideal for this group, which doesn't mean we can't kind of, sometimes it won't sort of move one way more than another or so on and so forth. But isn't this, do we agree that this is a great example of the sweet spot where we'd like to be?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're doing are two different processes. We're tossing out ideas for topics. And then we're talking about the level that we want to consider it at.
Yeah.
And so we've tossed out a couple of topics and then we now say that we want to consider it at several different levels, as I was picking up.
Yeah. Roger that, Dorothy. Thanks.
So I understand that this is not to be considered online pornography.
So you're saying you wouldn't suggest that as a topic, but you know there are possibilities there.
What an idea. We've got.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I thought this was excellent.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Tom in that, and that's just my preference. Is I like stimulating conversation that comes from people who have a basis, a common basis of interest in learning and a common basis of scientific understanding, you know, understand research and whatnot. But then the added part is to enjoy all your stimulating company, more or less. You know what I'm saying? I mean, this epitomizes for me this group. Just a group of bright people who are interested in stuff in the biosciences.
Well, I just want to say that I'm not a scientist, but I
No,
work
right?
very well as a vice president of a tech university.
There
So
you
even
go.
though I haven't studied science, and many of us may not have, we have enough understanding to
Yeah.
appreciate the conversation. Sometimes it gets a little deep for us, but we still are learning.
Mhm.
And I'm just hoping people don't say, oh, she doesn't know anything, I'm not going to listen to her or him. But we accept what other people have to say. So I'm just encouraging to continue, even though we may not 100% understand the deep technology, but we do learn something.
Exactly, Arlene. Yeah.
What is your feelings about Zoom versus in person. This time had to be Zoom because I wasn't sure if I'd still be infectious with something. I don't think I am. Manu especially hopes I'm not, but I. But but it's also partially that I'm afraid of picking up infections that I would bring back to my husband, who is pretty vulnerable at the moment. So is Zoom adequate that we could continue with this for a couple more times until his health gets better, or would you like to go back in person? I'm not infectious anymore, so that's not a concern.
Well,
So hold it in somebody else's house.
Yeah, so Manu, I don't know if you heard, Manu said we could hold it someone else's house too.
yeah.
And I could just join by Zoom if I was worried, although right now he's recovered better than I have from the last one, so.
It's certainly, I think wouldn't we tend to lose some people if we did not have it in Zoom, if it was always in person? I doubt that I would have been able to come to, just for example, on this occasion, I doubt that I would have been able to come, could afford to come today if it were not on Zoom.
Yeah, me
Same for
too.
me. I probably would not participate in person, just because of the time constraints of driving somewhere and coming back.
Right.
This fits better into my day.
So Zoom is certainly easier for me, but will we lose other people because
Yeah.
it's not in person? Probably, I don't know.
I don't know. We'd need to ask the people who weren't here.
Yeah, well, the people who weren't here, a couple of them were traveling, I know that, so.
Dorothy, you
I'll
said
send
that
out
people don't have
a
the.
flyer to people, but I guess if we have it in person, we probably do need it in some other location, so we could do it at the library. Or if someone else wants to volunteer a location, we could do it there.
How many people are we?
We're 12.
Well, today.
I can see
And
12 in my apartment, but
Yeah.
I'm already having the book groups meeting there because it's a good place to meet.
Okay.
I personally could not, I don't have a car at my disposal, and the time to get out and away to another place increases the total amount of time devoted to the meeting, or else takes away from the time we can devote to the meeting. So I would vote for the continuing this way.
Shall we vote? I mean, we have some people here.
Dorothy, is the issue, and losing people that's in person, because they wouldn't be able to have the capability to get online for a Zoom? I didn't quite.
I think the two other regular Zoom in-person attendees I know are traveling right now. So I don't think, and I know that we have been losing people because it was in person.
Oh.
Sure.
Oh,
So Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah, no reason not to do Zoom and reasons to do Zoom. So
yeah. I mean, the option would be Zoom hybrid, but right now, I don't know if I actually, when I moved to this apartment, so I had a big room, and I have 2 TVs so that I could do Zoom hybrid, but I've gotten less ambitious with age. And so I could set it up, but I keep not. Dave, you have your hand up, or is that my hand that's up?
No.
Corner. Okay, I don't know what that hand is.
Okay.
Is there someone else's hand up? No.
I've got to run. Bye all. Good to see you all.
Bye.
Be well.
Bye.
All right, see you.
We'll have a topic of either learning or sleep. Which would you prefer next time? Fast.
Sleep.
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 Okay, sleep.
Learn to sleep.
Yeah, so we'll have a snooze session on Zoom.
But the idea that to get the personal observation on children learning mixed in with the scientific would be great.
Yeah,
I think sometime. Yeah.
Yeah. okay.
All right.
Bye all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Jamie.
See
Thank you,
all.
Dorothy.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.